I feel a need to define once more some of the words I use in the series. I've done so before, but I think it is required again to amplify what I am saying, to clarify it within the context I've set up in this war like no other series of videos. This will help clarify the other videos I've made, accentuate some of the points, and dispel some of the misunderstandings I still think some people are burdened with. Meme. The sum of all perspectives, ideas, ideals, spiritual outlooks, symbols, creating a particular psychology, a particular perspective. I use the spelling meme to as an M-E-M-E to emphasize the relationship with genes, because I think they're the continuance of genes, not separate from them, but a continuation of what genes are and how they work. Genes are codes evolved within particular environments, passing on a way of organizing energies, creating an organism. They are biological programming created by trial and error, naturally selected, in other words, directing energies and placing them in relationship to each other within a context. A gene represents a probability within the possibilities of the world. These probabilities are inherited, changed, and then passed on. In this inheriting and passing forth phase, mutations occur during reproduction. Slight effects from environmental conditions can cause these small divergences. Another way of saying probability is higher possibility or pattern. Ordering is a patterned behavior. That's the definition of order. It's a phenomena, behavior showing a pattern, a predictable pattern. Memes are also codes of conduct, codes of acting, which includes both behavior and thinking, thinking being an act. Language is the medium by which memes are propagated. Letters, words are akin to nucleotides and DNA. Memes organizing organisms into societies, resulting in cultures. Just as the genes direct energies to create an organism, organizing bioenergies, so does a meme direct organisms, resulting in a super organism, a tribe, a city, a nation, a culture. A civilization is the end product of this cultural organization. A meme also establishes probabilities, as it represents a way of thinking which directs possibility towards a particular outcome, an ideal, an objective. The ideal is the projected desirable outcome of every mimetic unity. An ideal is constructed by using ideas. Like all projected ideals or objectives, it helps orient the organism and direct its will. Ideas are directed and organized by mimetic predispositions. As with genetic transference, mimetic replication also results in mutations caused by particular environmental conditions affecting the mimetic replication at the moment of transference. This is how ideas and consequently ideals morph and change over time. This is also how memes result in a splintering. An idea commences as a unit and then it splinters off into subcategories, into collateral ideals, sometimes resulting in conflict, such as the Cold War or communism and Christianity, which comes from common roots and yet results in a conflict. Also, as with genetics, memes cannot escape their past, but are the manifestation of the sum total of everything which made it possible and everything that occurred during its becoming. This is why memes may alter and show variations over time, but they adhere to some basic shared principles. They adhere to a memory, which is what the code is. It's a transference of memory. More on this later. With genetics, evolution does not make the modern, the current, totally alien from the primal, the previous. With memetics, the current representation of the inherited is related to what preceded it. And for this reason, secular humanism, for example, can be traced back to Judaism as a worldview, an attitude, a psychology directly linked to mimetic inheritance with Christianity, and from there with Judaism. We can proceed further back, but we'll stop there. Evolution applies to memes as it does to genes. With genes, an organism is fertilized with the genes of another organism, resulting in splicing and recombination. This is the point where mutations occur. The resulting recombination then gestates for a period of time and is then birthed as an organism, a new organizing unity, now with its own possibilities, but still limited by inherited probabilities. Will is not free, after all. It's prohibited by its own nature. With memes, an organization, a superorganism, a culture, and ideology fertilizes the brain with words. It does so linguistically. The understanding of the fertilizing unity, playing the part of the male in this example, is transferred using words to another brain. In the transference, mutations may occur, resulting in cultural divergence and differing interpretations of the same words, the same ideas, and so resulting in different variants of the ideal, the shared ideal. These ideas, transferred using language, then gestate in the brain for a period of time and are birthed as the individual's brain's outlook, its character, its psychology, its perspective. Where meme and gene differ is in method. Genes rely on trial and error, on blind natural selection, where the environment filters out using the female sex and directs genetic outcomes. With meme, the guiding principle is willful, conscious, and directed towards a projected objective, which we call an idea or an ideal. The female's filtering role is usurped by masculine control. That's why it must be controlled and directed. Female sexuality must be dominated. This is where the conflict and the animosity between the sexes begins. The method used to spread the nihilistic meme begins by hijacking and redefining words. Words referring to concepts, abstractions, ideas, ideals. Concepts which in turn refer to the world. Nihilism redefines words, essentially turning them into their opposite or harnessing them to a particular perspective where the moment the word is spoken and heard, the idea and all the sensations, emotions, images which have become associated with it, ingrained into the mind through constant repetition, Pavlovian training, to the point where the word and the idea it symbolizes are now permanently connected with these sensations, emotions, and images. This is how manipulation works. This is how politics works. This is how the system controls the masses. Particular emphasis should be given to how words become associated with emotions, such as love, hate, envy, because nihilism, being totally detached from reality, or attempting to detach itself from it, offers pipe dreams and utopias and paradises. And it can only refer back to conceptions which are detached from reality. It must avoid referring its own ideas to the perceived reality because it is incapable of doing so, since its conceptions are detached from the real. This is why you'll find many liberals unable or unwilling to refer back to natural behavioral patterns as exhibited by other species. They feel uncomfortable doing so because they cannot support their views by doing so. So what they do is they claim that man is so complex as to be totally void of any animalistic behavior, that What applies to animals does not apply to humans. This is the way of detaching from nature. Its strongest mechanism is achieving this feat of self-delusion and convenient escapism by using emotions. Emotions are nothing more than automatic reactions created in time, naturally, to particular stimuli. Because emotions are automatic, unconsciously derived, created by the brain in reaction to sensations, sensual stimuli, and because emotions are self-interested in that they are felt as positive or negative in relation to the organism's interests and needs, they can more easily be manipulated. They are primal and visceral, and they are often used by the progressives and the pseudo-intellectual, rationalistic, enlightened ones to pretend to be above the primal, when, in fact, their entire argumentation rests on the visceral, the intuitive, the instinctive, the primitive, subjective, organic reaction to stimuli. In other words, their entire argument rests on emotion, and that's why they use emotion constantly and everywhere. They either accuse the opposition of hate or anger or violence, trying to create a sensation, or they try to pull on heartstrings using love, of course, compassion, and all those words that are supposed to stimulate the infantile in the brain to overcome the rational. It is because emotions are visceral that they are often irrational. We fear the dark, for example, automatically, because nature always leans towards the negative to ensure that any surprises that may lurk in the unknown are not detrimental to the organism. The logic here is one accounting for the negative nature of reality in relation to the organism, this antagonism between ordering and entropy, which we measure with time. Nature prefers to err on the negative because the reverse would be devastating to the organism. Any negative surprise, any mistake would mean death, whereas the opposite, any positive mistake or mistake towards the negative, making the surprise a positive thing, will not mean death. Nature accounts for the antagonism between entropy, increasing chaos, and life as the state of constant self-organizing, despite the naive musings of dilettantes and men-children. It is because emotions are self-serving and unconscious, automated reactions that they can be easily manipulated by a will that knows of their nature and of human nature, though most dismiss human nature as a fabrication. Brainwashing and indoctrination, training, and domesticating inferior minds is the manipulation of natural tendencies, as these have been established through natural selection over time. It is therefore easy to manipulate a mind into believing any truth, to seduce it into any perspective which satisfies some inner need, even if it may not be aware of it or may deny the existence of the urge and this need. A dog need not be aware of itself nor of its own nature to have a human who is aware of its nature more than it is of itself, to train it by using these innate canine qualities. In fact, the dog not knowing makes it more easy for a human to manipulate a dog's nature. This is why we get dumbing down. This is why we get the dismissal of Freud and of anybody who shows us insights into human nature. And this is why fear and shame are the first defensive words used by liberals and the nihilists. It is the shame and fear they feel in themselves in relation to life, existence, which makes them react with this defensive accusation. With nihilism, the overturning of reality, the turning of reality on its head, is easily accomplished as an ideology, a desirable ideal, because the common, average mind feels a sense of insecurity anxiety towards a world that does not care for its interests or its preferences. The world is so perplexing to it, so confusing that it feels anxious when trying to make sense of it. Telling someone that appearances do not matter, and that consequently sex and race are all human fabrications, which is the opposite of what is true, is not hard to do because the mind wants this to be fact. The actual fact is that the opposite is true, in that it is human intervention, human fabrication, which tries to turn appearance and all its prerequisites into fakes, into lies, into pretenses based on nothing more than words. It's not sex, which is a human fabrication, for example, nor is gender, which is no more than the application of sexual roles within particular cultural circumstances, but the opposite. It is the elimination and discrediting of sexual roles, which is the human fabrication. And it is only possible within human environments, artificial environments. I will explain what artificial means later. This is a classic case displaying how nihilism takes reality and turns it on its head, like I said, which is the quintessential act of nihilism, of nihilistic despair, to totally denounce, contradict the real, and replace it with an ideal, a fantasy, where the imagination is totally detached from reality. That's what fantasy is. It's imagination detached from reality. The very usage of the term nihilism, as it is used academically, also shows similar methodologies. It is now used to define the opposite of what it signifies. In other words, annulment, nullification of reality. Now it becomes a term used to explain how the nullification of reality is nullified. In other words, the negation of the negative is now maintained as the negative, whereas the original negation of reality is now posited as the positive. We will find that if we look carefully, we'll find many words which are now become associated with the opposite of what they originally intended to refer to. Let's not even go to the obvious man-woman farce dominating modern debates about justice and equality. The very concepts of justice and equality themselves are human inventions, human fabrications, and are now eternally associated with the prevailing mimetic nihilism, this cult of victimhood. Nihilism itself. The common usage of the term is in reference to the absence of absolutes, or a teleos, or meaning or purpose. The linguistic hijacking of the definition is part of the mimetic codes, the method of nihilistic procreation. By definition, my definition is in relation to the perceived, the aesthetic, the sensual, without imposing my preference upon it. To be nihilistic is to nullify, reject, deny reality. Reality as it is perceived, imagining instead hidden worlds, absolutes which can never be seen or justified, and where there are none. To be nihilistic is to impose upon the universe, upon reality, a purpose and a meaning which resides outside the human brain. In other words, to make it transcendental, to deify it, to make it something holy and profound. And instead of making it a tool, a method for humanity, something humanity must create, it places it outside of humanity, something which hypocritically must be found. And who is to tell us where it is to be found but the nihilists themselves? The antagonistic relationship between the self-organizing entity, the living organism, and the world, as this towards chaos, this towards increasing entropy, results in a denouncement of the world. It leads to self-hatred. and in a settling upon human constructs which soothe and placate and satisfy psychological needs. Modernity is a culture which is a byproduct of a nihilistic meme, at least it is so in our time and in our place in the West. And it's becoming global because the shrinking spaces, increasing populations, declining resources makes nihilism very attractive to the majority which would not have been alive without them. A nihilistic meme is a meme resulting in a worldview, a mindset, a psychology which contradicts everything perceived, everything sensual, everything aesthetic. Beauty itself is denied relevance. Since there are no absolutes, this attitude is not to be taken as being totally nihilistic, but selectively so. The nihilist is a hypocrite. He chooses when to apply nihilism, when not to. The degree to which a mind denies reality, in other words is nihilistic, is determined by the mind's dissatisfaction, its sense of insecurity in relation to the perceived, in relation to the real, to the world. The more of reality it rejects, or tries to ignore, or tries to deny relevance to, the more nihilistic it is. Solipsism is the end result of this psychological tendency, a form of self-referential cocooning, intellectual cocooning, where the mind does not reference the sensual, the empirical, the world directly, but references and defers to another mind's conceptions, defers to another mind's opinions, perspectives. In other words, defers to another who is telling him exactly what it wants to hear. Or in true solipsistic style, it refers back to its own abstractions. In other words, it justifies its own opinions by referring back to its own opinions in a looping effect. That's what solipsism is. That's what cocooning is. It's self-referential. When these abstractions are totally detached from the real, in other words, they're the product of combining elements into artificial unities. For instance, when we think of, let's say, an extreme imaginary concept like a unicorn, we combine a creature with another element which does not occur in nature. This is an imagining totally void of any reference to the real. This is what I call the abstraction, which is fantasy, that is imagination detached from reality. And this is what a nihilist does. It refers back to conceptions it has fabricated by combining elements that do not coexist in reality, and it has created this false reality, which it then refers back to justify its own opinions. And the more a mind is the product of a sheltering environment, brought up within sheltering environments, the more cocooned, the more forgetful, the more void of self-knowledge, the more self-blinding it is, all the more unable it becomes to deal with reality. This leads to a self-perpetuating atrophying, which we call decadence. The mind is now unable to cope with any taste of reality, to the point where the mere mention of certain words makes it close itself off from any consideration. It now reverts back to its defensive stance as this has been learned, taught to it. And it just repeats the emotional reasoning, the arguments it was given as defense, and just repeats them as if it's making sense. All human categories are used to accentuate a difference, so as to bring into clarity a phenomenon. We accentuate the difference between two twins so as to discern one from the other, knowing that no matter how great these similarities are, it is the difference which distinguishes and differentiates. Similarity, a favorite concept for the nihilist, for the liberal, who wishes to disappear in uniformity of the singular, into nothingness, or the nothing or something duality, is really a byproduct of divergence. An organism, this self-organizing becoming, first separates itself using the membrane, the skin, the bone, the skull, forming from the otherness, so as to then organize itself within this porous, flexible boundary, which it sets up to become a unity and to distinguish itself from others. Without this separation of self from otherness, there is no consciousness and no organism. There's not even the possibility of this. There is no identity, for to identify is to possess memory, and to possess memory one must order, distinguish, and discriminate. Therefore, one perceives similarities only after one has differentiated self from other. No matter how similar two phenomena are, these similarities are partial and dependent on a simplification and generalization, conveniently directed by emotion most of the time, rather than reason. Not even clones are perfectly alike, and nor is the self the same as the self a minute ago. Flux means constant change, and this prevents absolutes, including absolute sameness. Identity, self, is a product of memory. The self is held together in memory. Genes are a form of memory. Every cell in my becoming carries those genes, and so it is a conduit of this memory. My brain stores experiences, knowledge being secondhand experiences, consciously attaching me to my memory, attaching me to my past. To be self-aware, self-conscious, is to become aware of your past and to recall it, to remember it, to be guided by it. The same way a gene, being the storage of memory, guides the organism in its becoming. Now we proceed to the concept of natural and artificial. Nature, as I've said before, is a word referring to the sum of all previous nurturing. It is a memory, making awareness of self possible. Nature is another term for the past. This becomes more obvious if we understand consciousness in Heidegger's sense, as a forever looking back. We are always a step behind existence because the time required for us to gather and process sensual stimuli makes the consequent abstractions, images, ideas a reference to a past state. To compensate for the lag between the idea and the real, nature evolves intelligence. Intelligence is a perception of patterns within the flux, which compensates for the time required to perceive reality. Man uses these patterns to project himself ahead so as to preempt reality and prepare. But no two projections are equal, as nothing is ever equal or similar, because some are based on sensuality while others refer back to earlier or inherited mental abstractions. Some are attached or attaching to reality, trying to remain so, while others are detached from reality, resulting in nihilism, which is the total overturning of reality and the belief in the opposite of what is perceived, a contradiction of reality. Artificial, in this case, does not mean unnatural, but it means an intervention upon the natural, often by using nihilistic fabrications, guided by a nihilistic motive, ideal. The motive being to disassociate, to detach, to shelter oneself away from reality. Let me clarify. All organisms intervene upon their environment to some degree or another. This exhibits the normal antagonism between the self-organizing unity we call an organism, life, and the flux, the totality of interactivities, which lies outside the organism's willful control, and so outside its organizing. When we speak of artificial in relation to natural, we refer to a degree of intervention. Let me clarify further. When the degrees of intervention all organisms exhibit naturally exceeds a certain point, it creates a self-referential solipsistic cocooning. What is this point? It is the point where the intervention and its consequences begin to affect the organism to a higher degree than the environment intervened upon. At this point, we have the beginning of institutionalization or domestication and its consequent feminization. When I use the term artificial environment, I mean the totality of human interventions upon nature, culminating in a man-made environment which now affects and directs human fate to a greater degree than does the natural environment man originally intervened upon. This, of course, implies a disharmony with nature, with all the collateral effects this entails. This produces not only benefits, but pollutants, both materially and genetically, which in turn demand further interventions. The snowballing effect leads to the necessity for more and more energies to be dedicated towards maintaining the artificial environment, in this way inhibiting growth and resulting in decay. The system eventually implodes, growing old over time, under the weight of its own actions. To compensate for this disharmony, this natural decline, which is essentially nature correcting itself, man must continuously find resources to energize his own artificial realities. Capitalism, with its association of value with market growth, is one example of this scramble to find energies to correct what man has done in the past and is continuing to do in the present. But the left, being part of the same system founded on nihilism, dreams of infinite technological corrections of two natural processes, so as to bring about its utopian, perfect world free of need, strife, discrimination, in other words, free of consciousness, and free of division, a concept of uniformity where the idea of individuality loses all meaning and must now be redefined in accordance with newfound nihilistic linguistic acrobatics.